Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast, listener-supported independent media. Please pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. And please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. Michael Tracey joins us today. In a wide-ranging discussion, we talk about the Democratic primary, the progression of Russiagate, Spygate, Ukrainegate, and how it led to the impeachment process that's going on right now. We discussed the investigate the investigators process going on in the background as well, and the media coverage of all the above. And in relation to the 2020 primary, we talk about the different candidates, their rallies and supporters, and we talk about Tulsi Gabbard's rise in the polls and her recent events and appearances, including her support for the 9/11 families. Michael Tracey's a journalist based in the New York City metro area, and he's the host of a podcast and a YouTube channel. His articles are published by many different media organizations, and he's a frequent commentator on TV and online media. We recorded this on November 11th, 2019. Michael Tracey's here talking to us from Jersey City. Hey, Michael, thanks for coming on the show.
Hello again. Good to be with you from the luxurious locale of Jersey City, the number one vacation destination for.
Hey, it's
all.
easier to get into Manhattan from Jersey City than it is for a lot of places in New York. So
it is. Actually, That was the premise behind the Airbnb referendum that was passed here last week over the objections of Airbnb, which poured over $4 million to oppose the referendum because the regulations in Jersey City are lax compared to Manhattan. And so Jersey City was actually a big market for Airbnb for people who just wanted a convenient location to get into the city. And now essentially it's going to be heavily regulated in Jersey City as well. So
yeah. Well, when I used to work for a Wall Street firm, I had to go into Lower Manhattan a lot, and sometimes I'd take the train up, but a lot of times I'd drive into Jersey City, and I'd just park. There were always parking spaces for the ferry, and I'd just get the ferry and go straight across to the World Financial Center, or I'd catch I think Journal Square, the PATH train that take me underneath the World Trade Center, and it was just a piece of cake, really easy to get there.
It is. Yeah, I live in the Journal Square vicinity. I'm not going to give my full address. but yeah, it is.
Don't want any visitors.
No, well, I mean, actually, I just met. I was in my local Walgreens maybe 2 weeks ago, and a guy came up to me and said, "Hey, are you Michael Tracey?" And at first, I thought he was accosting me or something, and maybe I was under arrest or I don't know what was going on. No, but it turned out to be a really nice guy. He just knew me from online stuff, so it's not so bad if I wouldn't rule out having visitors, but I don't know that it would be a great idea to give my address.
No. Yeah, well, you do a lot of on-camera stuff, and I wonder how many people actually know you and would recognize you on the street. Probably thousands and thousands of people. And that's kind of weird.
It's a bit. I mean, I've had a fair amount of people recognize me, but usually if I go to an event where there's some kind of theme that would make people likely to recognize me, but it's not that often where I'm just in a random place like a Walgreens that somebody would recognize me. But for example, when I went to the Bernie rally with AOC in Queens, whenever that was, a month ago or so, and the first 2 or 3 people that I spoke to, I just happened to be standing online with, knew who I was, which is sort of it's still a little weird for me because I don't feel like I'm that notable of a person, but at a certain point you do sort of get accustomed to just random people knowing who you are just based on what you look like, which is, it's cool actually. So
yeah, it's got to be cool, but kind of weird too. But whatever, it is what it is. So, well, speaking of that,
sometimes they're like, "Oh, you're the guy from Twitter." I'm like, "Well, I mean, I do stuff other than tweet, but sure, I guess."
The talking about the campaigns, the primary. So you said that you went to I haven't been to a Bernie event. I did go to a Tulsi event in New York, which was where I met you. We were both early supporters of Tulsi. I don't know where you stand. I haven't officially chosen any candidate. I mean, our primaries are so late. It's like forget about it anyway. It is usually the candidate is chosen by then.
Yeah,
But
New Jersey is like usually among the very last states. I don't know what the exact calendar is this year, but
usually
I
in
would
June.
assume it's roughly the same. Yeah, in June, like it doesn't matter.
It did matter, I guess, with Hillary and Obama. So it could
Yeah,
be a
some
really important state if it's neck and neck. So maybe this time,
which is
I mean, it
possible.
might be. But you've been to, didn't you also go to an Elizabeth Warren rally?
Yeah, I did.
Like, what's the difference? Like, I have seen my kids have been to Bernie rallies, and I mean, it's a mob scene, and there's a lot of energy and everything. And I, even before Bernie started going up in the polls, I still feel like he's got a lot more support than the polls are showing, just because of what he's got 1 million volunteers, and I always felt the same way about Tulsi, but Elizabeth Warren, I just don't see the same kind of energy. And Buttigieg, like I'm shocked about these poll numbers with Buttigieg, and I'm a skeptic, and I just think most things have been corrupted, so I tend to not trust. I go back and forth. Sometimes I trust the polls, sometimes I don't. But like, what's been your vibe when you've been to these different candidates' rallies?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I should clarify that I haven't like formally endorsed Tulsi either. Obviously, if you follow my commentary or reporting or whatever on her, you could detect a somewhat supportive tone. But that's largely a product of the tone of the rest of the coverage of her being so
Yeah,
awful that I almost feel like something of an obligation to provide a counterweight to that.
yeah, I know what you mean.
Um, no, but I do like her on a personal and political level. So, I mean, I'm all about transparency, and I don't know that would be very difficult to discern anyway. But but just for the record, so people don't feel as though I'm being cagey or anything.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Like I would call myself a supporter, but I haven't chosen any candidate. I also support Bernie, although I have some issues with both of them. But I don't expect to
yeah,
be fully on board with any candidate. But those are my two
yeah.
top candidates.
So I mean, I've been to candidate events now in a variety of places: New York, New Hampshire, South Carolina, even Florida. Going to try to get to Iowa, hopefully in the next maybe 2 weeks or so.
Oh,
Um, yeah, and but it's sort of an interesting contrast between Bernie and Warren that I can sort of narrow just to their big rallies that happened in New York City, and obviously rallies that happen elsewhere are going to have different vibes and different sort of demographic compositions. But I thought it was interesting just to observe the attendees at the Warren rally versus the Bernie rally. When I was at the Bernie rally in Queens with AOC, I just sort of did a flippant tweet about how the crowd just seemed fundamentally cooler at the Bernie rally than the Warren rally, and that wasn't some like great analytical conclusion or anything. It was just sort of capturing how at the Warren rally, from what I observed, there are a lot of sort of well-to-do professional class types. Um, a lot of older, not older, but sort of like
middle-aged,
women
older
age
women.
40 and over, yeah,
Hmm.
who are partly crossover Hillary people, partly not. Like I spoke to some women there who weren't particularly fond of Hillary, so it's a mix. Um, but you had a fair amount of people who are like middle-aged and older, whereas if you're at the Bernie rally, you could count the number of people who were over 50 on like one hand, which in a way is kind of a pretty ominous electoral liability for Bernie, because I would think for him to win the nomination, he'd have to do a little better among people who are aged, um, because they vote at much higher rates. They are, I'm not sure about this exactly numerically, but among the largest blocks of voters in terms of age in the primaries. And if he is still at 2% with people 65 and over, for example, which some of the most recent polling has suggested, then it's a little difficult to see how that develops into a winning plurality for him. Although, who's to say? I guess some of them might be persuaded if he wins a couple early states. But at the Bernie rally, obviously it's sort of specific to New York, which is its own unique sort of political environment. But there's a lot of organized activist support for Bernie, and you can sort of tell that among the people who showed up.
The
But at the war,
T-shirts and stuff.
yeah, well, yeah, and you could just like there's almost like an activist look, like you can tell that they probably belong to some kind of group, or they do
Okay.
canvassing, or they're involved in like grassroots organizing, right? And the Warren people have that too, but they're sort of like much more connected to the sort of liberal organizing apparatus, like the Democratic Party. Like one thing that I noticed, and I mentioned this on a live stream after the rally, but like one of the placards they passed around at the Warren rally was "I'm a Warren Democrat."
Mm.
Emphasis on the Democrat.
Yeah, yeah.
And I can't really see "I'm a Sanders Democrat" placards being passed around at a Bernie rally. So there's just there are subtle distinctions among the people who would go to these things that if you have sort of a trained eye, you can identify. But the most conspicuous one was the age disparity, I think, and that's sort of reflected in the polls. I mean, Warren does much better than Bernie among older people. Her coalition is a little more evenly distributed, whereas Bernie's much more reliant on younger voters, which maybe that can be a workable coalition, but yeah,
Yeah.
we shall see.
Yeah, that's interesting because among the people that I hang around with online, if you will, they are, it's a pretty even distribution, and there are a lot of older people who support Bernie. So, but if the polling is not showing it, then we are, we're outliers. Um, but
You're already an outlier if you discuss politics regularly on the internet,
yeah, I guess so.
which is a sad revelation that some of us probably should take more heed of.
Well, I think I know the demographic or the vibe that you're talking about because back in 2008, I was an Edward supporter, and he, as you know, dropped out like not too long before the. I forget because my partner's in Pennsylvania. Maybe it was right before the Pennsylvania primary, but I had to pretty quickly choose another candidate, and I was torn between Hillary and Obama at the time.
Yeah.
I.
If memory serves, he dropped out after Super Tuesday,
Mm,
which was a little bit, and the Pennsylvania primary in 2008 was in April, so there was like a 2 or 3 month span there. Not that it matters, but
yeah.
just going back into my memory bank from the '08 race when I was an Obama supporter, uh, pretty committed one. So I canvassed in New Hampshire and the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, so I think I ended up, I ended up voting for. I know I voted for him in the general, but I was going back and forth. There were just a couple of things that I was worried about experience. I remember, so I actually went to a Hillary rally in North Jersey, and I forget where it was, whether it was like Paramus or uh maybe it was outside in Newark. I don't remember, but I didn't know anybody, so we went there and I remember when I went back to the restroom area, there's this hallway, and there were sort of all these insiders. They were clearly party apparatchiks, and they just like kind of looked me up and down, and then they almost like interrogated me. Like, who are you? And I'm like, oh my gosh, okay. I mean, it's not that they were unfriendly, but they had this insider, like, do you belong or do you not kind of thing. So I'm really not surprised at all to, I mean, there were other people there. There were some unions, and I think Menendez was there. And
Right.
yeah, so at this point, I would never ever consider voting for Hillary. But before her stint as Secretary of State, I didn't really understand who she really was. So, and I think she actually changed too. But
Yeah, I
uh,
think I went to the first rally in New Jersey that Obama ever did, which would have been in October or November of 2007, and it was hosted by Cory Booker in Newark. Um, and I went there just with a supporter's mindset more so than somebody who is like journalistically going to go and analyze things. So I can't really recall much. I didn't go into it with the mindset that I would go to something like that now. Um, but I feel like there was less of an insidery vibe at Obama events, which was compared to Hillary's. Even though Obama did have a fair amount of establishment support, but it was still pretty heavily outweighed by Hillary's establishment support. You know, with the whole superdelegate stuff, and the Clinton connections going back decades, even at that point. Um,
yeah, it
so
was palpable. It was you. I knew within a fairly short period of time that this was the infamous New Jersey political machine, the Democratic Party machine.
right,
I knew that's who I was in and amongst. And like I said, after they sort of questioned me, this big group of women and some other people, um, because sometimes you end up having to wait in line, and they were literally looking me up and down and sort of evaluating me, which was pretty kind of pretty funny. But I
yeah,
remember like driving to the polls, thinking, who am I going to vote for? I really didn't have any big preference between Obama and Hillary. I liked Obama, but foreign policy wise, I was really worried that he was just going to get uh, steamrolled.
right,
So, and he kind of did, but
yeah, he did kind of. He got steamrolled by Hillary, in fact,
mm.
which is just like, so what was the whole primary about? Right.
Yeah. So we ended up getting both of them anyway. But
Yeah. It's sort of interesting this cycle because everybody who you'd ordinarily associate with the New Jersey political machine endorsed Booker really early on, partially because it's just a home state thing, and they want to keep the engine running in terms of the New Jersey solidarity, whatever.
yeah,
Um, but Booker doesn't have a whole lot of endorsements elsewhere. I mean, he has some in Iowa, uh, but it's sort of like it's an odd position for the New Jersey Democratic establishment because it's ordinarily they would just go behind like a Clinton or probably a Biden if Booker wasn't running, but now they sort of just out of obligation had to make those early endorsements. So their loyalties have sort of been splintered.
so that's interesting too. The So let's get into Tulsi a little bit. We were scheduled to talk a little bit earlier, and then Jimmy Dore had a live interview with Tulsi, and so
Right.
we
So we had an
postponed up.
emergency delay to watch the interview with Tulsi on
Yeah.
Jimmy Dore, which I think was wholly justified.
Yes, right. So, what did you think of the interview that they did? I thought it was nothing big, nothing really new in there.
I thought
Uh,
it
al-
was. Yeah, go ahead.
Although there are some new things I wanted to ask you about, but I didn't hear anything that surprised me. We got a little bit more detail on her Medicare for All proposal, but other than that, um, wasn't any there weren't any breaking news from that I detected, but I may have missed it.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty good.
Yeah.
I think that I'm in favor of her doing right wing media, even though it drives people crazy, and she's done a fair amount of it. So it was actually somewhat refreshing to see her back in that format with somebody who's questioning her from, obviously, a left wing perspective. So, um, that alone I thought was not breaking news, but it was sort of a departure from a lot of the media that she has been doing recently. Um, and I was at the press conference that she was referencing in Lower Manhattan when she was with these families of 9/11 victims calling on.
Oh, yeah, I did want to
Yeah,
ask you about that. I really didn't catch. I knew she did it, but I don't know anything about it. So if you could tell us about it.
yeah. I mean, she talked about it a little bit, and people, if they're interested, can go and watch the full press conference. But essentially, in 2016, Congress passed a law authorizing people who were affected by 9/11 to sue the Saudi government, which had previously not been a legal avenue available to them. And Obama actually vetoed the bill, and it was overridden by the House and the Senate. I think it was only one of two times in Obama's entire presidency when he had a veto overridden. So that opened up this lawsuit, which is now ongoing, seeking information in the possession of both the Saudi and U.S. government about the role of various Saudi officials in aiding the 9/11 hijackers. And I mean, she touched on this, but it is sort of insane that this many years later we still don't have all that information in the public record.
Exactly.
So there's a one of the lawyers who is himself a 9/11 he was injured in the 9/11 attacks, talked about how he is under a court order not to disclose the name of a high-level Saudi government official who is believed to have provided financial assistance to some of the hijackers who were in California, and not just financial assistance, but actually like facilitated flying lessons to some of the hijackers, which is like sort of the core of the entire attack. And yet, we still don't have that name, and he could be prosecuted if he disclosed that name. So Tulsi was basically calling on the Trump administration to, and including the Department of Justice, to allow for the disclosure of that information. And one thing that they talked about on the Jimmy Dore appearance was how some really bad faith and sleazy journalists tried to construe that call on Tulsi's part as like somehow she's involved in the 9/11 truth movement.
Oh,
Now as
okay.
if like she's conspiracy theorizing because they say raising questions about 9/11 automatically means that you're like a classic truther, when no, she's like responding to a lawsuit
Exactly.
that was off that Congress overwhelmingly allowed for 3 years ago. But because they want to portray her as a crank, and they want to delegitimize her, they tried to make it so that she was somehow feeding on, the internet fever swamps or something, and trying to attract fringe supporters. And if you watch the Jimmy Dore segment, they sort of went through this ridiculous Huffington Post article, which I pilloried at the time, which sort of put forward that line. But it's sort of it was apparently she's the only candidate who's been responsive to the request from these 9/11 victims groups to help them in sort of making the public case for why this information ought to be in the public record, which is a little strange because I mean there's nothing less. I mean you would think it would be very politically uncontroversial to help 9/11 families get that information, but people just don't. There hasn't been any other interest on the part of candidates, at least according to these victims groups, in sort of assisting them.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So the other candidates basically don't want to touch it. And yeah, it doesn't surprise me that they threw the conspiracy theory defense at her. That's the knee jerk defense for any inconvenient information or issues. But
And the other knee jerk charge, which you could also read in this like absolutely ludicrous Huffington Post article, which is just like bottom of the barrel gutter trash. On top of the conspiracy theory angle, of course, they tried to fold it into this whole notion of her helping Russia because, of course, she's a Russian asset. Because somehow feeding into conspiracy theories
Oh, yeah.
is what Russia wants because it creates division in the United States and makes people question institutions or something.
Uh-huh.
So that was part of the whole delegitimization shtick in that article, which they spent a lot of the interview responding to. So I thought that was good. I mean, I had heard a lot of that before, so it wasn't new information to me. I thought her clarifying the Medicare for all / single payer stance was useful
Hmm.
because she's been pretty consistent about her position on that since at least the beginning of the campaign, and then going back several years when she was one of the first co-sponsors of the Bernie Medicare for All bill in the House. Um, but there was one interview that she did on NPR in late September where she sort of introduced a new phrase to describe what she was advocating, and it sort of confused people. I think with some legitimacy because the way she put it, I think she said Medicare choice, something to that effect,
Yeah, it confused me actually.
and it came across like she was watering down her position, or maybe had pivoted to public option or something, and I don't think that's what she intended, and they sort of cleaned that up pretty quickly. And then if you look at like her public appearances, even days after that interview, she said basically what she had always said, having to do with Medicare for all. And then this was sort of the final clarification of that because she actually called it single payer plus and laid out the basics of what that would entail, which is definitely not a public option. So I think that was, I don't know that I would say breaking news. I mean, she's not a leading candidate still, so it's not as though like a policy clarification that she makes is going to set the world on fire in terms of its newsworthiness. But I thought that was useful. I kind of had hoped that Jimmy might ask her just to comment on the Bolivia situation.
Yeah.
But other than that, I thought it was pretty good.
Yeah, yeah, I did too. He didn't have that much time with her, so and he wanted to address her her appearance on The View, which was good. You can't do that too many times in my view because that was great. But speaking of a leading candidate, um, let's talk real quick about the new polls for people who haven't seen them. I know I tweeted about the one of them. I don't recall which one it was, but it was the first one in which she was ahead of Kamala Harris, which, there's all kinds of irony in that because in their first battle during the debates, uh, right after right after the debates, they got Kamala Harris on camera for a response to Tulsi's challenge to her on stage about her prosecution record, and Kamala Harris dismissed Tulsi and said that she she said, maybe this is going to seem immodest, but I'm a top tier candidate, so I don't really worry about attacks from lower
Right.
candidates. And now Tulsi's beating her in the polls, which has that's gotta really.
That's
I
gotta hurt.
wonder if Kamala's going to go after her She's now qualified for the November debates, and she might. What does she need? One more poll
Yeah, she
to.
just needs one more poll to qualify for the December debates, which, I mean, she's one of the few candidates who is kind of on a consistent upward trajectory, as sort of minimal as it may be in terms of like total support as reflected in the polls. But nonetheless, I mean, she has been inching up. Yeah, Kamala is such a top tier candidate at this point that she basically shuttered her entire operation in New Hampshire, as if that's like the sign of a healthy campaign. And
Yeah.
now she's basically going to go live in Iowa, which usually does not work. I mean, I don't think Iowans don't tend to be impressed by the fact that you quote unquote live there for a couple months because you're so committed to getting their caucus support.
Hmm.
Um, but the latest poll that came out today, I think, was Tulsi's among Tulsi's highest poll standings in New Hampshire yet. So she was at 6%.
Right after Bernie.
Yeah, yeah.
So it was like Biden, Warren, Buttigieg, Bernie, and then Tulsi at six. I mean, that was really something.
Yeah,
Um,
which, I mean, if nothing else, I mean, Biden was at 20 and then the rest, but 20 is not a lot of support for the leading candidate in New Hampshire, which I think tells you that the race is still quite fluid. Obviously, it's just one poll, but there are a lot of indications that the race is very fluid. I mean, there's a scenario that I sort of sketched out in my mind when the polling came out showing Pete basically in contention in Iowa. That there's a scenario that's not entirely far-fetched that a different candidate could win each of the 4 early states. Which could, if that happens, that may mean that New Jersey actually is significant, because it would almost guarantee a very protracted race going down to the wire and maybe even to the convention. But there's also a scenario where somebody sweeps the 4 early states. So the bottom line is there's a lot of variability in terms of what may happen.
Yeah, I tend to think that's by design, but that's a whole nother conversation. So
By design, meaning maybe
well,
we don't have to have the conversation, but like, who designed it?
well, I don't know. The various big donors, big players, Clintons, just wanting there to be a lot of wanting the vote to be fractured so that Bernie doesn't run away with it. That's sort
Well,
of,
I mean,
and
that's
possibly
why.
setting it up for the superdelegate second round choice of a candidate. Though that would be a disaster if they let the superdelegates
Well, I mean,
choose.
the donor class of the party is clearly in a weak position now, because you have, 2 weeks ago or so, they floated Hillary potentially getting in, and she didn't. She was entertaining at least the possibility. That seems vanishingly unlikely, thankfully. But that's how now Bloomberg is potentially. I mean, I think we can say that Bloomberg is running because he formally filed paperwork in Alabama and will be appearing on the Alabama primary ballot. So, like, he's running because
Yeah, it's weird.
you can go and vote for him in Alabama next year, which is bizarre. And now, even today, Deval Patrick is saying he's seriously considering it, and of course they leaked it to the New York Times. So if you have that much disruption in that wing of the party, that sort of indicates that they're in a weak position, because they're sort of scrambling with these far-flung, last-minute potential candidacies. Which is, there's an irony there, because like Biden has still pretty much led almost every poll for the entire year, even though he's gone down somewhat. He's still in a fairly strong position. I mean, not the strongest, but he's weak enough where you have these donor class types, breaking the glass and pulling the alarm.
Yeah.
Which is why now, you have the whole this Bloomberg thing, and Deval Patrick, and Eric Holder was saying, "Hey, maybe I'll
right.
do it." But I mean, there's not long. The filing deadline for New Hampshire is Friday, so I mean, they got to get their act together pretty quick.
Well, I think Bloomberg wants to avoid the first few primaries, right? Because he knows he doesn't have any chance. Didn't he?
Yeah, they said that he
heard
was
that.
going to do the Giuliani strategy redux. Remember in 2008, Giuliani said, "Yeah, I'm not going to really contest Iowa or New Hampshire or anywhere. I'm going to wait till Florida." And Floridians were just like, "No, you didn't establish that you were at all formidable in the first several contests. So why would that be a plausible strategy?" I mean, I guess if you're Bloomberg and you could just spend literally billions of dollars flooding the entire country's TV airwaves, maybe you think that's a more tenable path for you. But
Well, you might
to
be
me, it just
seeing
seems
that, like,
nuts.
it kind of worked for Steyer a little bit, right? I mean, how did that guy qualify for the debates? I mean, I don't even get that.
He spent tons of money on TV and Facebook that was catered specifically to Iowa, South Carolina, Nevada, New Hampshire. So if you compare his national polling to his state polling, there's a gigantic drop off. He comes up with 1% in national polls, but there have been like Nevada polls, for example, where he's up at 6 or 7. And that's purely a function of him absolutely bombarding the state with everything that he's got financially. So it actually worked.
Yeah, so I guess that still works to some extent anyway. At least it gets you to a certain point.
Well,
Um,
it got him to the point of being able to qualify for the debates. And remember, he had to spend money. He lost money begging people to donate $1,
yeah, that's right.
which didn't, which like totally inverted the whole logic behind that debate qualification metric.
Yeah,
So I think he spent something like, I don't have the exact number, but it was something ridiculous, like $20 for every $1
yeah,
donation.
yeah.
It's just like
That's
that's all that's doing is basically enriching Facebook and making the people who devise the rules look like idiots.
yeah, exactly. I don't know. We'll see, but I think Bloomberg is gonna. I've never seen him as a particularly popular figure, and he doesn't have any charisma. There's not really much about him that, other than his fellow billionaires, like maybe some New Yorkers, I guess, who liked him as a mayor.
I don't know if you
But
saw this, but Judge Judy went on the Bill Maher show last week. I think it was like one of the very rare times where she does a TV interview, and Bill Maher, and she did it solely because she wanted to go on and plead with Bill Maher's audience to support Mike Bloomberg. Like that was
yeah,
why she went on the show, because she was saying Bloomberg is the guy who can do X, Y, and Z, unite the country, whatever. So he's already got a high profile circuit there in Judge Judy, who's also
well,
probably close to a billionaire herself, given how that massively successful show has been in syndication for like 20 years and she owns it.
I guess so. But I don't know how big her audience is. I can come up with a vision of her with a ruffly collar or something, but that's about it. I don't think I've ever watched, other than catching 5 minutes of it here or there. I've never watched her show, but I guess a lot of people do, or it wouldn't still be on TV. So,
Yeah.
uh,
I have a visceral loathing of Bloomberg because I lived in New York for a while he was mayor, and particularly during the Occupy Wall Street
yeah, I remember
era.
that.
And the conduct of the NYPD over the course of that period is sort of like seared indelibly into my brain. And he's the one who set the policy and, like raided the park in this sort of like paramilitary, adventure in the middle of the night and rounded people up. And it was insanity. So
Yeah,
for for that reason alone, my disdain for him is very very visceral and and I express that quite vehemently.
yeah, I was following that closely myself. I was there like 4 times on a weekend. I went there like the first 4 weekends, or among the first couple of months, and I saw what it was like early on and sort of organically, and I saw what it turned into. I was watching that night when I think it was Tim Pool who was live streaming the raid on the park, and then I just watched
Yeah, I was there
the
that night for the raid.
the undermining of the whole thing. I watched it all happen in real time.
Yeah, I mean, I watched it. It was interesting because it was one of the first opportunities to witness a political event through live streaming technology. So I did that, but it was in conjunction with actually being there, because there was always something new that you could see that was going on that somebody else picked up on through live stream or through tweeting or whatever. But I was there for the raid. I think it was October. I think it was November 11th or something, 2011. But yeah, I mean, when you saw how that was carried out, and it was illegal, by the way. I mean, Bloomberg defied a court order that barred him from launching the raid, and yeah, it's just something that just sticks with you.
yeah, it does. It really does. I didn't know you were there. You were live streaming Occupy
No,
Wall Street.
I didn't really live stream it. I took a little bit of video, but it was before I really I didn't have a setup to live stream at that
Yeah.
point. But I tweeted a lot. I wrote about it. I mean, you could still go up and go look up my articles. That was back when Mother Jones published me.
Uh,
So that was so I wrote about it for Mother Jones and other publications. I actually had a high level police, I don't know, a commander of some kind during one of the like frenetic breakouts of chaos. He just punched me in the
yeah,
shoulder.
yeah. One of the white shirts.
Yeah, the white shirts, but like not just any white shirt. It was somebody who's like you could go find his bio on a municipal New York City website. Like I think he commanded the entire precinct for Lower Manhattan. I still remember his name. It was Arthur Schmock. I mean, he's probably still around.
Appropriate
But
name.
yeah, but he just slugged me in the shoulder, and I never did it. I never like filed a complaint or really did anything with it. But yeah, Keith Olbermann had me on his show that night to discuss it.
I
But
saw them actually reach into peaceful marches and just reach in and grab people reach in and grab a protester and just throw them to the ground or hit them. Or I saw that kind of thing
they
myself.
were, I mean, they were totally lawless. I mean, they would basically chase people down on their motor scooters and corner people. There was one person I saw that got ran over by a motor scooter. And look, I know that some of it wasn't all the cops. I mean, some were more hospitable than others, but the white shirts were just out of control,
Yeah.
and they basically crushed it
Yeah.
eventually, thanks to Bloomberg. So,
He
no,
even showed up there
it's a no,
himself.
it's a no on Mike for me.
Yeah, well, like celebrities started showing up. Sean Lennon showed up, and you could see as it got more, it was gained more momentum. They were like, we're gonna shut this thing down,
Yeah, I
and
remember Bill De Blasio showed up. It was back when he was public advocate.
that part I didn't remember, but I
Yeah,
remember that Bloomberg himself went down there. I wasn't there then, but it was somebody was live streaming it. And you're like the live stream thing, that really was the beginning of live streaming events. I remember reading that the New York Times issued all of their reporters with iPhones after that because it dawned on them that you know what kind of reporting could be done on the spot with a smartphone. Just
yep,
an aside.
yep. Kanye West showed up. Um, which just shows how politically malleable he is.
Yeah,
Um,
I guess. I didn't know that.
yeah.
I didn't
Yeah.
remember that. I probably didn't know who he was at the time.
Oh, I knew him. I was a big Kanye fan and still am. So that was a big deal. But yeah, what did become sort of like a pilgrimage for a lot of celebs and even political figures. And there was always interesting dynamics. Now I'm sort of reminiscing, but like always a minority of like Ron Paul supporters. And in Philadelphia at the Occupy Philly encampment, like the Ron Paul supporters had their own like section that they ran, and they had to like coexist with the other people, and it was very interesting to cover, and just sort of like look at it from different angles, how it varies across regions and cities, because it's spread everywhere, and even into the 2012 election there was Occupy. I mean, I embedded with like Occupy New Hampshire people who went around to candidate events and interrupted stuff, and they had their own encampments, and it was just it was a heady time because I had been there right when it started, like when it was just this. It just seemed like a very typical New York City, uh, activist gathering that wasn't particularly notable, and then within like 2 or 3 weeks it spread across the world.
Yeah,
Like
it
we
did.
would watch with our mouths open as like Occupy Spain, Madrid or whatever. It just was like late. It was escalating into just gigantic uh, demonstrations. And we're like, wait, we were there when there were like 12 people there.
Yeah, I have video the Sunday, so the second day I was there, and I have video of, they used to have the regular marches. Zuccotti Park was just like a couple blocks from Wall Street. And so they used to, say, all right, 4 o'clock, we're going to march on Wall Street. And it literally was like 15 or 20 people, so much that there's this one girl's voice that you can hear above all the others. Whose street, our street, and the chants that came. So the chants survived. The V mask you still see at any given protest across the world. You still see those. It has, it definitely, they killed it, they squashed it, but they didn't really. It's still, I would say that the Bernie movement is, at least in part, a continuation of the Occupy Wall Street movement too. So
yeah, and it did sort of instill just a cross-partisan anti-establishmentarianism, as sort of reflected in, like, for example, the Ron Paul people showing up. There were always like a handful of right wingers that were there, and veterans who were just sort of like interested in it, in the notion of it, and even sympathetic with aspects of it, because I mean there were many different interpretations of what Occupy meant, but I mean, the 1% versus the 99% isn't necessarily like a doctrinaire left wing interpretation.
no.
So it did leave, I think, space for a lot of anti-establishment sentiment to ferment. And yeah, the Bernie campaign is one continuation of it, but it did have a wider impact, just I think, on the political ethos of the country, in ways that are not always straightforward in terms of like deciphering them.
Yeah, I remember coming out of that thinking, before Occupy Wall Street and the 99% 1% thing, everybody knew that there was an upper class, there were, rich people and poor people and this big amalgamous middle. But you started getting an idea of the numbers, the concentration of wealth. And those are things that really were never really talked about, in the media before. And I think that was a big part of it, is that people started to understand just how concentrated the wealth was in so few hands. And then Bernie picked that up and ran with it. And he still does today. He'll throw out some numbers, some real numbers. And people are like, whoa, okay, I realized that there was a concentration of wealth, but I don't think anybody realized just just how extreme it was. And I think that alone, and also just the whole thing of, like you said, a transpartisan, an opportunity for a transpartisan type movement, which was greatly discouraged among my Democrat, like in the Daily Kos community. I can remember actually,
Yeah.
people writing, warning us off. Don't form a coalition with libertarians. They actually tried to tell us that that libertarians would fool us. They would trick us. And all these ridiculous arguments, because and we see it now today with like the kind of crap that Tulsi gets, don't go on right wing TV.
Right.
There's no real reason for that other than worrying that the partisan lines might disintegrate a little bit around the edges.
Well, the first three politicians of national stature who expressed support for Occupy were Ron Paul, Dennis Kucinich, and Bernie Sanders, which I think is illustrative in its own right in terms of the transpartisan potential. Like in my coverage of it, I tried to emphasize that dimension, just to sort of highlight how ostensibly different political sensibilities could converge if the circumstances are right. And that was one circumstance where it did happen to some extent. And just thinking back now, the ethic of that movement and the wider sort of protests and actions that it spurred just seemed to me so much healthier than what the ethic of like street protests today are.
Yeah.
Because today it's just all Trump all the time. Like you couldn't have, I don't think, a similarly inclined protest movement that was focused on like oligarchy or on like the structures of society, and that really kind of delved deep into basic societal questions in the way that Occupy did. Today, it would just be whatever the latest anti-Trump slogan is, and it's just so much less constructive.
Yeah, I was a big pro-protest person in those years, and also in the anti-war years and the later Bush years. But I don't think now I'd even show up for a protest. I mean, I have no interest in it.
No, I mean, I wouldn't rule out doing that if something were to arise, but yeah, it just today it's just dominated by this sort of very reactive left liberal fusionism um, that manifests in like the Women's March and stuff like that. That's very tethered to short-term Trump-oriented goals. Like, I mean, I went to a bunch of Russiagate protests uh, that were just, I mean, depressing does not even begin to describe how horrible they were. And that's just sort of what's been fostered over the past couple of years. Like, I was just thinking about this recently, but after the Mueller, after the William Barr put out his letter summarizing
Yeah,
the Mueller report.
yeah, pre-Mueller report.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, that was a nice vacation for us. Those couple weeks between the Barr
yeah,
letter and the Mueller report. Uh, I could
yeah,
explain
yeah,
further, but it seems so trivial now. But anyway, like I went to a rally that was organized in Times Square by all the big liberal establishment activist groups, essentially, like Move On, Indivisible, and it was just so feckless. It's just like they were chanting, release the report, as if the report was being withheld
yeah,
consciously from them for malicious reasons. And it was just like, do you people understand that like they're going to release the report in a couple weeks?
yeah.
Like, why are you here? And it's just because they had to be there for something Trump, Barr, Russia. That's just not the mentality that would have been prevalent in 2011. I feel like 2011 has a much deeper impact on the political circumstances of the country because it was focused on structural issues. It wasn't like about Obama, right?
No,
I mean, people didn't particularly like Obama at the Occupy protests and the Occupy encampments and such, but it's not like the entire theory of why they were there was predicated on their hatred of Obama, right? It was something far beyond that. And today it would
yeah,
just be all Trump all the time.
yeah. It was an issues-based protest. It was really a populist movement, is what it was, and it's still there. It's just it's just been clouded by Trump, basically everything being hyper Trump. I over the last couple days, actually I shouldn't hold you. I don't know. Do you have a little bit more time or
Yeah,
no?
sure.
Okay, good. Um, I put on the cable TV on mute. I can't watch it with sound, and I said for a couple days I'm just gonna leave it on and I'll just skim through it. Put on CNN for 15 minutes, and then the other ones, just to see what the chyrons are and the headlines and what they're. And literally, it was all impeachment and Trump every single time. I mean, maybe, all right, maybe once something else was on, but it was day and night, and even on the weekend, just always impeachment and Trump. And I thought to myself, what are they going to do if they actually remove this guy from office? Like, I have serious doubts whether they really do want to remove him, or what they're going to do if they don't. But it's just this complete hyper focus on it, as if nothing else is going on in the world, and none of these populist issues, of course, are covered. And it's just shocking to me, this whole impeachment parade, and just this whole progression of the Russiagate, and then to the Spygate, and now the Ukrainegate, and now impeachment. And I just read this book by Lee Smith. I think maybe the first sort of right wing book I've ever bought, but I shouldn't say that because I try not to be too. I'm really not a partisan anymore. I'm still a registered Democrat because I'm going to vote for this primary, but I really feel like a political exile, to be honest. I don't feel like there's any party for me or organized party at the moment. But I read this Lee Smith book, and it was kind of interesting. It went through. It was mainly focused on Nunez and the way that Nunez went about doing the Spygate investigation or whatever you want to call it. They called it Objective Medusa. I guess they actually had a name for an operation for it. He talks about the team that he assembled, and he actually had like ex intelligence people. He had this guy Kash Patel, who I guess I should have known who that was, but I didn't. Who really kind of led? He was the star of the Nunez team. He was former DOJ, and he was former JSOC. He was like, I guess, doing global targeting for the. I don't know if that was drones or what, but he had some experience in the intelligence arena and in the DOJ arena, and he became an aide for Nunez's committee, and so he was the one who was really digging, finding out all the stuff that was happening against the targeting of the Trump campaign and all that. And then after the Dems took over the House, then they took him off of Nunez's committee. I think Nunez was no longer the chairman even before that, I think, but they put him in the National Security Council inside the White House, and he actually dug up some of this stuff on Ukraine too. But what have you been hearing about Russiagate and the Ukrainegate thing and the impeachment? Like, just I know this is a huge topic, but
Yeah.
what are your latest thoughts on this? I guess like where do you think this is going? What are your impressions about the whole thing with Ukraine? Just to try to fit that in the end there.
Yeah. Well, when you mention watching cable news with the sound off, which is just like, first of all, why bother watching cable news in the first place, I guess.
Yeah.
But if you're going to just be able to see the pretty graphics fly across the screen, I guess it's worth just
Well, mainly if you're going to
tuning in every now and
criticize
then.
it, I feel like if you're going to criticize it, you kind of have to have seen a little bit of it. That's my theory, but
Yeah,
just to get a sense.
I don't actually have a television, so I'm one of those rascal millennial types, I guess, where I'm
Yeah,
just
we still have
disconnected.
one.
Okay, yeah. But I mean, you could still get all the latest samplings from cable news online if you really want to.
Yeah.
So every now and then I'll check in on what's going on, especially if there's like an interview or something that I feel I need to see, even though most of the time it's totally worthless. But it does remind me that 2017 was like a record-breaking year for MSNBC in particular in terms of ratings, which was very unusual because usually ratings spike during election years,
Yeah.
and then they sort of taper off once people sort of like return to their regular news consumption routines. But that didn't happen in 2017. It just went up and up and up and up. And that was because like every day, especially for like the first half of 2017, there was some alleged Russia bombshell breaking, and people were just glued to their TV sets, and MSNBC made a fortune on that. So they're trying to replicate it to some extent now with this latest impeachment saga, but it almost, I don't know, maybe I'm looking at this through the wrong lens, but it almost comes across as like incredibly boring.
Yeah.
Like there's not a whole lot, at least with Russiagate, there was like some pretty clear-cut, significant ideological dimensions to it that you could focus on because they portended a lot for what the opposition to Trump was going to look like, what the pro-Trump forces look like. Seemed like there were some big stakes, not in terms of the substance of what supposedly occurred in terms of a Trump-Russia conspiracy, which didn't exist, but in terms of how it was sort of, how that allegation was internalized by the media and the political class and the body politic writ large. I mean, there was some big issues there. But here it's just like it. There's so much hinges on these seemingly insignificant procedural technicalities, and you always have some new person now whose testimony is coming out. Who, I mean, the media, of course, they want to scour it for bombshell news, but I don't know. It comes across as just sort of like a again, just almost stiflingly insignificant. And yet now this is what they want to impeach him on. And I guess in a way it's a fitting culmination of the anti-Trump opposition. But even as somebody like me who like at least ostensibly follows news somewhat for a living, like it's part of just what I do, I find myself getting fatigued by it and like my eyes rolling into the back of my head when I try to, catch up on like what latest hijinks is Rudy Giuliani up to. It also seems like nothing, and that's just the sense that I find it hard to get past as I at least attempt to follow, the daily outrages that are supposedly arising out of this thing. I don't know if you feel
Yeah, I
feel a similar way.
that same fatigue, and I'm a person who has been following it pretty closely, not as closely as the people who follow every detail. But I read the documents and think like I'm not even bothering to read the documents this time. I'm much more interested in the what's going on behind the scenes, or what I think is going on behind the scenes. For instance, the Horowitz IG report, the Durham criminal investigation. I don't know whether any of those are going to turn out to be much in terms of accountability. I mean, I'm sure there's information that'll come out and all that, but to me, it's the impeachment seems to be two things. It seems like a long plan. Like I think that the Mueller investigation was always going to lay out those obstruction. Part two of the Mueller report had all the various obstruction charges, similar to the way the Starr report had. And I think to a certain,
it was an impeachment referral essentially.
Yeah, and they followed. To me, it was almost a revenge for the Starr investigation, or at the very least, they followed the same. For the report, they followed sort of some of the same patterns to lay out the charges and then to lay out the possible obstruction things that Congress could pick up and run with for an impeachment. I think impeachment was always the end goal of the Mueller report. It's just that it collapsed. And then it got after the Mueller testimony, I think they realized that politically it was really in trouble. And then they revived it. But there was always going to be an impeachment process. It was always going to be timed right around now. And they hope that it'll go to a trial.
So remember, there was sort of a quasi-impeachment process even before the whole Ukraine stuff burst onto the scene, because Gerald Nadler claimed that the Judiciary Committee, of which he is the chairman, was conducting an impeachment inquiry. Even going back into the summer. Yeah. Remember, there was a point where majority of the Democratic caucus supported impeachment proceedings solely on the basis of Russia and Mueller. And then that just sort of got folded into this Ukraine business. And even though like the substantive core of the Russia issue fell apart, at least if you're minimally intellectually honest about it, it nonetheless created like a foundation for impeachment from which Ukraine could arise, right? So there is a narrative continuity there that I think a lot of people gloss over because they're so embroiled in the minutia of the latest happenings with regard to Ukraine, who's testifying on a given day. Again, what's Rudy up to? That kind of thing, that they sort of miss the bigger picture, which is that this is a sort of an extension. It's sort of like it's a continuation of what preceded it by way of Mueller, but it's just sort of by a different name and with some different details. But if there had been no Mueller, right, there would have been no Ukraine. I mean, even in that in the infamous like Zelensky phone call that Trump did in July, he rants about Mueller. I mean, he mentions Mueller by name, and one of the things that he quote unquote pressures Zelensky to investigate is are issues pursuant to the Barr investigation into Spygate, as you put it. So there's like direct continuity there. It's not just sort of like an abstract narrative continuity. It's actually a concrete one after another.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that's sort of the aspect that I am most interested. I think like you in keeping tabs on more so than the day to day, uproars, which don't seem to ever really amount to much. Although on the other hand, he probably will be impeached.
Yeah, it does look that way. I didn't think that I had my doubts that they were going to follow through on it, but um, I don't think that they expect the Senate to to have a long trial because, as someone pointed out, the timing of this, like let's say they bring up the articles of impeachment. Well, first, let me first say too, right from the start, almost immediately after Trump was elected, some people at the New York Times and some others somebody had a Watergate obsession, and I mean, CNN hired Carl Bernstein, and they had him talking about it all the time. And that guy has, I don't know, I'd say maybe 20 different times he has cited some bombshell aspect of the Russiagate thing, and he said, "This is just like Watergate." They're trying so hard to.
It's worse than Watergate.
Oh yeah, worse than Watergate. But
I remember during the Bush administration, John Dean, who now gets trotted out
oh yeah,
as this like figurehead for historical recognition of the severity of whatever's going on with Trump. He wrote a book called "Worse Than Watergate" in reference to Bush and Cheney, which is true. I think that was actually a valid assertion on his part, but his whole mantra now, the whole reason he exists, at least for the purposes of the media, is to proclaim that such and such is worse than Watergate. Otherwise they'd have no use for him. And during the quasi impeachment hearings that were going on under the auspices of Nadler, I don't know if you remember it, but they tried to have this sort of bogus televised impeachment hearing, and they brought out John Dean as their star witness to testify on Mueller related issues. So you have this like very tired cast of characters that get
well,
foisted upon us.
did you know that Hillary actually worked on the I guess the Judiciary Committee staff for Watergate?
I did know that, yes. Yeah.
So
And then she the storyline is that she could have kind of like marshaled that into a higher level job in Washington, but decided to go with Bill to Arkansas.
I didn't know that part, but I still think that it's the Clintons that are mainly Hillary that are the main driver behind all of this. Plus, all of her cronies who did all kinds of stuff for her during the election, and now they're in jeopardy. And I just think that the parallel between what fascinates me is the Durham investigation, the Horowitz investigation, and Devin Nunes and whoever else is working with him, and he does name a lot of them. Um, as they make progress on it, it seems like the impeachment thing is this other thing that's happening, and there's a tension between the two. And of course, I'm not in the back room, so I don't know. But almost like each side is using them as leverage in some way. It wouldn't surprise me if someday when we find out what really happened with all this stuff that was going on. Um, and yeah, that's too much of a rabbit hole to get into for now. But
Well,
so
I mean,
you,
I don't know if Hillary herself is pulling the strings per
I don't know
se,
how
but
she
there is
has so
there
much power. Yeah.
but there is a huge network of people in the media and elsewhere who are indebted to her in one way or another, or feel that she was wrongly deprived of the presidency in 2016, who are still have that front of mind in how they deal with political events. So even if she's not directly, issuing the orders, I do think that that's a factor in why there's this, never-ending thirst for revenge that could only be actualized through, like an impeachment or the final revelation of a Trump-Russia conspiracy, which people may use the Ukraine issue to claim exists. Adam Schiff and Pelosi and such, they incorporate the logic of Russiagate in talking about Ukraine when they say that, oh, he withheld military aid to Ukraine so they couldn't fend off Russian aggressors.
Yes.
Why is Trump so intent on doing that? Just because they've got something on him. So that line is still sort of in the ether.
But the knee-jerk conspiracy theory thing, the things that actually factually happened with Ukraine during the 2016 campaign, which is, I would argue, was the thing that Trump and some of the people around him, are still trying to dig up the details, and they're trying to expose it, the Spygate stuff, if you will. The media, including, up to the most elite media, they're actually there's a factual story behind that, starting that it first came out with the January 2017 Politico article by Ken Vogel, who has sort of abandoned that whole line of inquiry at the moment. But like Matt Taibbi tweeted today, he said, the way Politico claims no evidence has emerged yet to support a story first broken by Politico is very reflective of the current press lunacy. And what he's talking about is, like I said, the Ken Vogel January 2017 article where there's a Ukraine whistleblower called Andrei Teleshenko, and there have been a few interviews with him now. And he explains what happened with, Alexandra Chalupa and Ambassador Chali, and how, they came up with the so-called Black Ledger or Manafort, and they did other things too, some less egregious things. So there's some like real collusion. I hate to even say it, but there really was. And now the Democrats and their partners in the media are calling that. They're saying that none of that's true. It's a conspiracy theory. That
Right.
That's shocking to me. And even Politico, as Matt points out, even Politico is saying no evidence has emerged yet, and still living on their own website is the evidence right there.
Yeah, it's funny because every time you hear that theory represented in just mainstream media reports, when they're talking about Trump on that phone call saying, maybe you should investigate 2016 Ukraine collision, they'll always depict that, or they'll always characterize it as totally debunked conspiracy theorizing. Like they don't even pretend to give it any credence. And obviously it exists. It's not just that Politico article, which almost has become seminal now, I guess, referenced constantly still, but there were follow-up reports to that, and there are aspects of the chalupas that I've delved into. It's a pretty insane rabbit hole that one day I'm going to distill into a sort of something that's narratively coherent.
Good.
So I've got the source material on that still. I don't want to spoil it on this podcast, as wonderful as this podcast is. But that obviously exists, and yet if you read the New York Times, they'll just matter-of-factly say the debunked conspiracy theory in reference to that whole aspect of things, and it's just like, why do that? I know why they do it. It's because they want to just, again, delegitimize anybody who would even pose questions along those lines, but it just shows how committed they are to a certain mentality that drives forward this narrative on Ukraine that doesn't leave any room for speculation or discussion of a lot of the factors that we've talked about a lot that I think stem ultimately from the Mueller investigation. That's the whole reason why Trump brought it up on the phone call in the first place, because it was the day after the Mueller testimony. He was just like, that thing seemed like it was a sham. Hey, Zelensky, if you have jurisdiction over any information that could shed light on how that scam came to be, maybe you should provide it to my attorney general, which is like not on its face a wholly unreasonable request. But they don't want to assign any logic at all to that request because it would have all kinds of implications in terms of the veracity of the storyline. So that's why I think they refer to it in such blunt, derisive terms, as if nobody in their right mind could ever even entertain it as plausible.
And I think that's really indicative of this whole thing. They've basically taken that, in some ways, just taken that whole story and turned it upside down. The whole just dismissing it all as a conspiracy theory, I can't decide if that's a sign of desperation or if it's just total dominance of the narrative and the media. I mean, there's more too. I mean, I've got that same source material that you're talking about, and there's a little bit more of it in Lee Smith's book in terms of the origin of the dossier, the proto dossier as he calls it, and sort of, the Cody Shear line of, that there was actually they call it the second dossier, but it looks more like this thing was cobbled together by political operatives and then laundered through Steele, which is a whole that changes everything too. And some of the characters in there are Jonathan Weiner. There are bits and pieces of it right out in the open, and somebody really does need to put it all together in a presentable format. They're going to come after you for it, but there's enough facts out there to bring that together, and it makes the whole thing make some more sense too.
Yeah, I'm working on it.
That's good. All right, well, I should let you go. Anything else we want to throw out there before we go?
I think we covered a lot of territory.
Yeah, I think we did too. Well, thank you so much, Michael. I'll put all of your links to your YouTube channel and your Twitter and your Patreon in the show notes for people. Maybe you just want to call it out real quick though before we shut down.
Yeah, Twitter M Tracey, YouTube M Tracey, everything is M Tracey.
Okay, that's easy.
Yep,
that makes it easy. All right, well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Michael Tracey. Follow him on Twitter at mtracey, MTRACEY. Subscribe to his YouTube channel and support his work at Patreon, patreon.com/mtracey. Around the Empire podcast is independent media, and your support's really important. So pitch in if you can at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. The syndicated audio podcast is the main focus here, and you can find it in many places, any of the mobile podcast apps, or on the website, aroundtheempire.com, Patreon, or on YouTube, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. And if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Follow on Twitter at aroundtheempire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.